G'day, Professor Joseph Drew. You guys have told me with the thumbs up that you really like the video about financial sustainability. In this video, I'm going to look at 15 years of data, 15 years of unit expenditure data. Stay tuned. I think you'll be extremely surprised at the results for the whole state, but also the results that are separate for urban and rural councils, respectively. So what am I doing here? I'm looking at unit expenditure. This is expenditure per property assessment. I know there's still lots of people wanting to talk about expenditure per person, but as I've shown in my videos and shown in lots of scholarly literature, and so have other scholars, that's the wrong functional unit. Sorry, it's just the plain wrong thing to be talking about. We need to talk about expenditure per property assessment. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at year-on-year changes. And I've gone back 15 years of my database, and I make up some summary statistics for the whole state of New South Wales. So we're looking at measures of central tendency, the mean and the median, but then there's no point ever looking at measures of central tendency without measures of spread. And you see this a lot. You see this a lot in commercial consultant work, of course, but also in policy documents where they look at averages and they don't give you the standard deviation. A measure of central tendency such as an average without a measure of spread is absolutely useless. So I give you all that data. And then what's really interesting is we'll look at and compare what happened to urban councils compared to rural councils. And I have simplified the graphs for those last two so we don't have too many coloured lines floating around. Look, the purpose of this and this series of videos, and we'll be looking at, rates and charges outstanding, different revenue components, different expenditure components. There's lots of stuff we can look at if I'm getting enough subscribers and if I'm getting enough thumbs up. The purpose of this is that facts have to triumph over fiction. At some stage, particularly in New South Wales, particularly with a new inquiry happening, we need to make a decision that it's going to be facts-based and proper, robust empirical evidence, not this guess and giggle rubbish we've had before and basic statistics misused, as any school child would be able to tell the authors of those reports that they've been misused. Proper, robust evidence. Now, this is just setting the scene, these videos. I've done lots of regression work and efficiency analysis for you, and I'll do more in the future. But I think you'll find this very interesting. The trends are very interesting, and it says a lot about financial sustainability, and it says a lot about the huge challenge that's before us that we're not really responding to sufficiently. Now, in this first graph, and please watch all, and just don't watch one and walk away because you're going to get misconceptions. As I said in that last slide, measures of central tendency, the mean and the median, without measures of spread are pretty useless in most occasions. This first slide is just going to show you the measures of central tendency because the next slide will have the measures of spread. But as you'll see on the next slide, there's lots of lines going all over the place. And if you don't know where the central lines are first, you're going to get confused very, very quickly. So measures of central tendency. What are we trying to do when we're talking about central tendency? It's the typical result that we're chasing. That's what central tendency is all about. Now, most people automatically go to the mean and the average. And in most instances, the mean and the average is not the best measure of central tendency at all. Most people go to it because they know what it is, like a cricketer's average, add up all their scores, divide it by the number of innings they batted in. And also, in the olden days, pocket calculators couldn't work out the mean. It's a time-intensive, memory-intensive thing for a computer to do, because you go compare all the scores, you put them in ascending order, etc. So for these reasons, most people tend to go to the average. But in a lot of instances in local government finance, the average is extremely misleading. Now, as you can see by this graph, because the green line, the mean or the average, is almost perfectly on top of the yellow line, which is the median or quartile 2, in this particular case, the average isn't misleading about central tendency. But remember, central tendency without spread is pretty darn useless. What's the other measure? The yellow line? That's the median. or quartile 2. If you put all the numbers in ascending order, 50% of the results are above that, 50% of the results are below that. The median is often a better measure of tendency, not always, but often, because it's resistant to skewing. If you have one really large number or one really small number, it can pull the whole average in each direction really radically. Whereas the median doesn't have that problem, of course, because you're picking out the middle number. It is what it is. Now let's have a look at this over time. And what can you see? You can see prior to the 2012 inquiry that the change, year-on-year change in unit costs, so per assessment. This is the best way to measure things if you're doing simple statistics, because obviously as a council gets bigger and you build more houses, there's going to be more expense because you've got more houses to service. So we need to look at unit costs to get a slightly sensible comparison. You can see that prior to the inquiry, as always happens prior to inquiries, same thing happened in Queensland and Victoria, those year-on-year changes were high. That's what precipitates an inquiry. And what you'll also notice is, prior to the amalgamation, and this also happened in Queensland, all of a sudden, year-on-year expenditure plummeted. Now, some of that was efficiencies, because all of a sudden councils were told, become more efficient or you'll cease to exist. Some of it, as I've shown in the scholarly literature, and there's videos about this, was gaming. I think it's a well-known secret that a lot of councils weren't doing their accounting accruals properly, particularly depreciation over that period of time. So this graph is bumpy. It shouldn't be this bumpy. It's bumpy, and it's bumpy for a reason. What I also want you to take notice of, though, is that most years of late, we've been hitting this line here, which is a 4% increase year on year on unit costs. You know, councils where things are growing in the city, where you're getting new buildings being built, it's even higher. This is the unit cost. So if you have more units, it's going to be even higher than that. What I also think you should take note of, and what the last graph was pointing out, is the crisis is here. Look at that last lot of data. This is a typical result. Typical result. Unit costs have increased by over 10%. If the key decision makers, ministers and things, aren't alarmed by this and aren't losing sleep about this, I don't know when they're going to. This is extremely concerning. Now, I give you the graph with all the lines there. So you can still see the yellow and the green lines, yeah? And the scale's changed a little bit. Now we have some new lines in there, and those lines are important. And you'll see why measures of spread are really important. Because have a look at this orange line here. This is the standard deviation. The standard deviation roughly is a measure of the distance, the average distance of points to the average, to the mean. Okay, and what do you notice about this standard deviation? It's extremely high. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that there's a big spread in the results that councils are having, below the mean and also above the mean. Now, when you look at the mean for that last year, and it's well over 10%, and then you consider that the standard deviation is extremely large, some councils are obviously in a real pickle. The unit costs are going up through the roof, astronomically. So that's why we need to know about spread. Now, there's two other measures here of spread. One is quartile 1. And as I said, a lot of statisticians, we prefer quartile. So quartile 1. So quartile 2, the median, remember, 50% of results above, 50% below, if we put them in ascending order. Now, basically what we do to find quartile 1 is we grab that bottom half and we find the middle point of it when we put it in ascending order. Okay, so 25% of the councils are below Q1 and 25% of the councils are between Q1 and the median. Now, what do you see in this grey line? You see a lot of the councils, or 25% of the councils, usually have negative unit growth in most years. That's awesome. obviously becoming more efficient, despite the fact that wages are coming up, unit costs, materials are coming up. You've still managed to reduce your unit costs. That's amazing. It's wonderful. It's what we want to see in a perfect world. But look at this last year. We've got Q1 there over 5%. So 75% of councils had unit cost growth over 5%. Extremely concerning. It's no longer negative. That's concerning. Very, very concerning. Now let's have a look at quartile 3. So quartile 3, same sort of idea. Take the top half, find the middle number. So 25% of the councils did worse than this. Now this is concerning because you can see that in most years, quartile 3 is sitting around the 8-9% mark. 8 or 9% growth in unit cost. Now you know your rate caps aren't growing by that, and you know your fags aren't growing by that. So what's happening? Deficits, debt, in all likelihood. Not in all cases, but in all likelihood. But look at this last year again. We have 25% of councils that had increase in unit costs, not far off 20%. 25% of councils had greater increase in unit costs than that. Now this is for the whole state, and as you'll see in the next slide, it's very different for urban councils and rural councils. I hope what the message you've taken away from this is how important measures of spread is, how useless measures of central tendency by themselves are if you don't have a feel for the measures of spread. Now the next slide only has the measures of central tendency and only one measure of central tendency because I don't want lines all over the place. You've got 5 lines here, I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you're going to compare rural and urban councils, you'd have 10 lines. It'd just be very difficult to read. But you now have a feel for the spread. You now know that when you're looking at those measures of central tendency, that the true results for a lot of councils are a lot worse or a lot better. There's a big difference between the typical, the measure of central tendency, and what lots of other councils are doing, what the bottom 25% of councils are doing, what the top 25% of councils are doing. So this one's looking at urban councils versus rural councils. And what do you see? You see, I think that in most years, rural councils face higher increase to their unit costs than urban councils. That's quite typical. Now, in my other videos, I've showed you that on the whole, economies of scale are a bit of a myth. They're very functionally specific. They only apply to a couple of functions and they occur at very low thresholds. That's been proven empirically in a robust way using regression analysis. So that doesn't account for it. What's happening in these rural councils to increase the unit costs? Well, I think there's 2 main things. If you live in a rural area, you'd be aware of it. One is that when you have an inflationary environment, and that's why this gap is opened up in the last couple of years in particular, inflation in rural areas is usually a lot higher than inflation in city areas, particularly if one of the key ingredients to inflation is energy costs, particularly fuel costs. Because how do materials get to rural areas? On trucks. And what do trucks burn? Fuel. So it's not surprising that rural councils are having more trouble controlling their unit costs than urban costs in a higher inflationary environment when one of the key drivers of inflation has been the price of oil. The other interesting thing about rural councils is, and I'm doing a paper on this right now actually, is that they tend to have a harsher operating environment. Demographically, they tend to have older populations, more pensioners, and that bubble of baby boomers has been moving along and it's hitting hard now, and all of a sudden they're having to produce new services and new infrastructure tailored to a rapidly aging population where the majority of the population in some of these councils has actually aged now. So that's one of the reasons, but their operating environment is still also harder in terms of the physical environment. We've got the effects of climate change. We've got the flooding, the extreme heat, and all those sorts of things. They take a huge toll, particularly on roads. What else is happening in that physical environment? The agricultural machinery is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and heavier and heavier and heavier, and it is churning up our roads worse than ever. The trucks are carrying bigger loads. It's churning up our roads worse than ever. So that's really going to hit the rural councils a lot harder than the city councils. If you're from the Grants Commission, can you please take note that your formulas for allocating the road grants couldn't be worse. I don't think you could do much worse if you tried. You seem to think that a motorcycle churns up the road just as much as a B double does, or a great big combine harvester does. That the Suzuki Swift does as much damage to the road as the combine harvester. It's completely flawed. The assumption, the logic at the base of your formulas is completely flawed. So it'd be nice if you could get that fixed. Okay, now we've only got the mean here. Now, why am I content to have the mean? Because, as you saw on that very first slide, the mean and the median are almost mapping on top of each other anyways. And in this particular case, the mean is okay. It's probably not a bad measure of central tendency. Remember, there's a fair bit of spread in these results. Remember, also to take away from this is that typically rural councils face higher increase in costs. You would hope that the fags would be increasing more for rural councils and urban councils to reflect the reality on the ground for rural councils. You would hope that the rate cap would be increasing more for rural councils and urban councils to reflect reality on the ground. And if those things aren't happening, rural councils will be under much more financial sustainability stress than urban councils. That's just a fact. Look, if you like these videos, if you want to see more, you need to do two things. It's as simple as that. Target 500. I need 500 people subscribing, or these videos will slow down to a trickle or stop at the end of this year. And thank you very much for people who have been recruiting. The numbers are going up slowly, but we've got 528 councils. It shouldn't be hard to get 500 subscribers. Second of all, you need to give it a thumbs up. That's how I know which types of videos you want. And if you don't tell me, I won't know. Look, if you want to send me comments and things, please do so. It's nice to have some positive feedback. This is hard. It takes my own personal time. It's not something I enjoy, so that would be nice. If you need to get in contact with me for advice, I'm always here to help. I help lots of councils informally and also formally from time to time. Look, thank you very much for your time. Goodbye. Just a quick note, as always, caveats with scholars. Remember, I'm still missing 16 councils. We're almost at the end of February, and there's still 16 councils that I don't have financial statements for. There's one council I still don't have the financial statements for the year before. Audit office, please don't just put up your fees, put up your quality and speed as well. That'd help lots of people. It's affecting the data, obviously. Those 16 councils might be very different to the rest of the councils, and that would change your answers. Don't forget target 500, and thanks again.